Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Therapy by the Book, the show where we take your favorite fictional characters and ask the question, what would it be like if they came to therapy? My name is William Haddad, and for this week's episode, our character client is Whitaker from Flight. This is quite the film. I actually saw this in theaters back when it first came out in 2012. And fun little fact that I swear is a complete coincidence. I didn't realize this until actually looking up some history about the story after viewing it again in preparation for this episode. But this is actually, not only is this directed by Robert Zemeckis, who also directed Castaway from last week's episode, but Flight was actually also the first live-action movie for Robert Zemeckis to make and direct since Castaway, over a decade earlier. Between that time, it was just other animated films that he was doing. So interesting little parallel, and ironically, both of these movies also involve a plane crash at the central core of what is moving the plot. So, Whitaker, who is he? Well, in short, he is an airline pilot and a very high-functioning alcoholic. From the very first scene that we're introduced to him in this story, we see him hungover from a heavy night of drinking, drugs, and sex on the morning of a flight. So as soon as this story opens, we know that our character client is somebody with a huge vice. It's practically the fabric that builds his very reality, although we don't know that necessarily at the point of introduction to him. Part of that is the way the story is told. Part of that is that he's actually very good at concealing this from the people around him, even those who know that he's something of a heavy drinker. It's a strategy that he's spent years coming up with in order to function. Despite alcohol being his primary addiction, he also has severe drug usage, often using cocaine in addition to alcohol as a counter, in order to stay alert and sharp, because his job as a pilot for an airline demands nothing less. So if you're familiar with alcoholism or addiction or anything like that, you may know or know of some people that would be called high-functioning alcoholics or high-functioning drug users. And it's very true. You don't have to be somebody who's living on the streets in order to have a severe addiction to a substance. And Whip is a great example of this. He's able to show up to work looking sharp, being cheerful, being joking, being on task and alert, and do his job and perform, to more or less all the expectations required of somebody in his capacity, and at the same time be somebody who drinks to excess and has a very unhealthy lifestyle in terms of his substance intake outside of working hours. Now, everything changes for Whip on a morning flight, that very morning's flight, where he wakes up hungover and has to get on a plane to pilot it to Atlanta. On the way over, a malfunction with the plane's tail occurs and causes a chain reaction of damage that cripples the airplane and leads to both engines failing and the plane itself unexpectedly pitching into a nosedive. It's a terrifying sequence of events that all happens so fast that even the crew are having trouble keeping up with what's going on. Whip is one of the few who maintains a sense of level-headedness and is able to keep thinking and responding to the situation despite the intense stress and danger that's suddenly taken over this entire airline. With some quick thinking and some very daring maneuvers, Whip actually manages to first flip the plane over so that they're flying upside down in order to level out from the dive. And he's then able to eventually turn it back over and glide the plane down over to an open field and turn what would have been a complete crash landing, killing everybody on plane, into just a very, very, very bumpy but still brutal landing that leads to 6 people out of the 102 on board being killed, but ultimately everyone else surviving, including himself. So it's intense, it's tragic, and very, very frightening. But ultimately, a lot of lives are saved thanks to Whip's actions, and he becomes overnight something of a local hero to the people in the town where it happens, and to the passengers on board, as well as the surviving crew. But during the aftermath of the crash, per protocol from the airline, there's an investigation to try to figure out step by step what happened, what went wrong, and what was going on up there in the air. And this is where things start to unravel. When he's admitted to the hospital blood labs are drawn from all the survivors, Whip included, and of course they reveal that there was a lot of alcohol and cocaine in his system from the night before, and in fact from the day of too. Although Whip conceals his actions during the flight from the rest of the passengers and crew, he actually makes a point to drink the onboard alcohol, vodka bottles that were provided, and suspends beverage service. This all happens before the storm and before the events that lead to the airline, that lead to the plane becoming crippled and crashing occur. Nobody knew, going into this flight that was going to happen. For Whip, this was just another routine flight, as well as an opportunity for him to indulge in his vice and addiction along the way. But now, as a result of the unexpected occurring, everything that he knows about his career and his duplicitous lifestyle is being put on the line. Now, there are plenty of people on Whip's side who want to help him stay out of jail, but if he's going to accomplish this, it means playing it straight with his substance habits, something that he's never done before. And even though he has friends such as the pilot union's rep, Charlie, who is there to help him out and make sure that the interviews and investigation procedures with him go smoothly and that he's not given any rough treatment or dragged under the bus. And even though there's the lawyer from Chicago hired by the union, Hugh Lang, who's there to work his magic to kill the toxology report from the hospital showing the blood that had the alcohol and cocaine levels, all of that is going to amount to nothing if Whip can't meet them halfway and make a change in his behavior and his addictive habits. So there's a lot to discuss in terms of Whip Whitaker's alcoholism. After the crash, we actually see him attempt to quit right away, and we see him, when he gets home, empty out all the alcohol he owns. He empties out decanters, he clears out the fridge of beer cans, pours it all down the toilet, even throws out some of the medication that the hospital gave him. And this in itself is not an uncommon occurrence for somebody to do, addict or no. Whenever anyone really goes through a scary traumatic experience like a plane crash, especially one as brutal and gripping as the one in this story, they'll sometimes experience what we might call a mortality check. It's a little more extreme than a reality check, I'd like to think. A mortality check is when a person goes through a situation where they're confronted with what you might call overwhelming proof of how close and real and scary death is and always has been. And many times they'll also walk away from this event with a realization of how precious life is as a result. Now, sometimes this sort of experience will indeed permanently change the nature of a person, but not always. And for addicts, it's rarely ever that simple. Trying to suddenly quit cold turkey after an intense event is something that many addicts can and will try. And Whip is no different, but it is much harder than it looks. And as we soon see for Whip, he barely makes it 24 hours before he's confronted by another situation that takes him right back to where he was. What occurs is that he actually ends up meeting with Charlie and the lawyer I mentioned before, who tell him of the disturbing implications of the toxology report, but also of how thorough and by the numbers this investigation is going to have to be, not just for the alcohol factor, but for the mechanical failure of the plane as well, given that there were 6 people who died and 2 of them were crew members, and the families of the deceased are going to be involved in wanting explanations. A lot is going to have to be uncovered. And as the lawyer, Lang, tells Whip, somebody's going to have to pay. And if you don't want it to be you, you're going to really have to step up and change things around for yourself. This is a lot to be confronted by so soon after what was already a pretty traumatic experience that he barely pulled himself and the other survivors out of. And it overwhelms him. And for Whip, it's all he needs. It's all it takes. The implications of being confronted by this and the weight and the pressure that that it's do or die. He's going to have to do this if he wants to have any hope of getting out of this with his credibility intact. Immediately after leaving the meeting, he goes to a liquor store and buys an enormous bottle of hard vodka and practically downs it. He's right back to where he was. to understand a little bit more about why he does this, why this is what he turns to so soon after, it seems like he's, to somebody who's not familiar with alcoholism, it might not make sense at first on the surface. You go from 100 to 100, first you're emptying out all the alcohol in your house and it seems like you've turned over a new leaf, but now suddenly you're reverting and you're drinking like there's no tomorrow. What's going on here? What's the thinking? Well, addiction to any substance at the core is all about meeting an emotional need. It doesn't really have anything to do with the alcohol itself, other than that it's acting as a form of self-medication for some other problem. Alcohol is really, when you think about it, the most effective antidepressant known to humanity. And it's been that way for centuries, if not millennia. Alcohol is great at numbing away emotional burdens, fear, anxiety, grief, depression, trauma, all the negative emotions that we're capable of experiencing as a species. Alcohol is great at wiping out in a beautiful, escapist fog of blissful numbness. And for somebody who has learned over years to use, and in Whip's case, rely on alcohol to cover up not just the heavy emotional stuff, but the little stuff as well, to be confronted by any kind of emotional truth and burden, such as what Charlie and Hugh are pushing on him with this investigation. It's practically baked into your chemistry at that point. In fact, it may literally be baked into your chemistry because of the way alcohol affects the blood and the liver and other parts of our body as a chemical substance, to feel like you have no choice or to even want to turn to it. It may not even be a question of feeling like you have no choice, but wanting to turn to it because you know from experience that it's the only thing you have. It's the only solution available to have any kind of effect on pushing back all of these scary things that you're feeling and struggling with. And at the very least for Whitaker, our character client, it's the only solution he's ever known. Being confronted by emotions of grief, of blame, of fear, especially after the crash, is overwhelming for him, and he doesn't know any other way to escape from that. In addition to his consumption of alcohol itself, there's a lot to be observed in Whip's behavior towards others as far as his addiction is concerned. When we look at the instances of him interacting with other characters throughout the story, he's always very quick to dismiss or push back against any kind of talk that seems to suggest or imply, however vaguely, that he might be accountable in some way for bad things, or even just in general, even just that he has a responsibility owed, bar none, no strings attached. He's very, very sensitive and prickly about that kind of talk. And we see that it doesn't matter who says it, and it doesn't matter how right they are. Whip is not in the mood to hear that kind of thing be suggested to him. He's more concerned, in fact, even in the aftermath of this terrible crash with people dead, we see that Whip is more concerned with there being no doubt in anyone else's mind, including his loved ones, that his drinking had nothing to do with the mechanical failure on the plane that led to the crash. In other words, his desire to control his fears and his addiction prevents him from grieving properly or processing the immediate trauma of his current situation. Another thing that we observe in Whip is a very deep sense of self-loathing. Behind his disregard for others' feelings, behind his aggression, behind the pettiness that he shows, or the might be perceived by others as a weird sort of callousness or detachment from the emotional gravity of everything that's happened and is continuing to happen in the aftermath of the crash, is actually a very deep-rooted hatred of himself. At the core, Whip is somebody who is disgusted by who he is and his habits, and you have to kind of look and read between the lines to pick up on that. But it is there. If you watch and you listen carefully to what he's saying and how he's saying it, and what it is in response that he's saying it to, you'll see that he hates himself very much. He loathes the person that he's become, and he loathes his drinking. He despises everything that it is and what it stands for and what it says about himself as a person. And this is also something that's very common for alcoholics or for drug addicts in general. Something that I used to do in my work before I went into private practice. One of my earlier jobs as an associate therapist was actually working at a detox facility. where there were clients from all over the country actually coming into the sober living facility, where they would first go through the detox process of getting off of whatever substance they'd been high on, be it alcohol, be it heroin, be it opioids. So I met a lot of different people who'd been on different kinds of substances, practically everyone that we have a name for, really. And that was something that I noticed in many of them, was that they would use everything, anger, humor, or it is what it is kind of attitude, to mask what was actually a lot of self-loathing and self-hatred of themselves, blaming themselves that it was their fault for being this way and feeling trapped and feeling helpless by what their addiction had become and how it had destroyed their lives. It was very, very sad. A lot of pain that these people were carrying around with them. And even though this is the case for Whip, just as it was for them, it's not easy to admit to this. Even though Whip knows in his heart, that this is who he is, and he knows that it's really him who's at the source of all the negativity that seems to accompany every conversation he ends up in. It's hard to fess up to that. It's much easier to simply project his anger and blame onto someone or anything else. We actually see a great example of this dynamic with another character in the story named Nicole. When we're introduced to her, she's not a passenger on the flight, but she is an addict of her own. She's a heroin addict. And we see that she's been struggling with heroin for quite a while, and her life is very much in shambles. We learn eventually that she actually had a mother who raised her as a single mom and was very close with, but then mom eventually died of breast cancer. And everything just kind of spiraled out for Nicole from there. So she's been in and out of, probably on and off the streets. Her car doesn't run, and she's living in kind of a very rundown complex of apartment buildings, and is most of the people she mixes with are drug addicts themselves, or dealers, or pimps, or pushers in human trafficking and pornography and other types of fields where there's just a lot of illegal and unhealthy activity going on. So she's, she hates herself as well, many of the same ways that Whip hates himself, and she's also struggling. And they encounter each other by chance, because she ends up getting admitted to the same hospital where Whip is being treated for the crash. She gets sent there after overdosing. And Whip initially, obviously, they have a couple things in common, so they connect. And initially, Whip helps her out. He gets her out of the apartment where she's having she's dealing with an abusive landlord, and she's trying to figure out how to make a living and get herself back on track. And so he gives her a place to stay. He, facilitates that and gives her the room to start going back to getting a job, and start going to classes again at night, and start attending AA meetings even. But as she starts recovering, an interesting change happens. She actually really benefits from the space that he gives her and the companionship. But as she recovers, she eventually laps him in the recovery process. She kind of starts to outpace Whip a little bit with her own growth. And so naturally, she notices more and more how much Whip is still trapped by the same patterns that she's been in, and very recently was in just as much as he was. But when she calls him on that problem, he lashes out. He pushes his own anger and his own self-loathing that I was talking about earlier onto her, pinning it back on her, making it seem like she's the one who's still got the problem, and that he doesn't need help. He's fine. He's got everything under control, even though, the world is really unfair and people are really trying to screw him over or mess things up for him. He's, he doesn't need any help. He's got this. So it's a lot of the, to an outsider, we might perceive as self-debauchery or sort of ironic self-degradation, and also grandiosity or narcissism or martyrdom. There's a lot of different terms for it that we might perceive at it as largely just variations on arrogance and disregard for Nicole's feelings. But really what it is underneath is it's Whip hiding from himself, which for anybody who's ever struggled with addiction or knows someone, especially someone close who struggled with addiction, you probably understand what that's like to witness and experience. Now, the breaking point for Whip is at the hearing for the investigation. Ultimately, it comes down to him having, if he wants to preserve his reputation as an airline pilot, he has to lie about what happened on the flight over before before everything went to hell. You see, earlier I mentioned that two of the 6 victims who died in the crash were crew members. One of them was a flight attendant named Katrina, who Whip was having an affair with. And actually, in the opening scene, when he wakes up after that night of partying, she's in his room with him. And we see that they've been getting it on. And the implication is that later is that they've been at this for a while. What is not made clear to us at the get-go is that Katrina is also something of an alcoholic. Even though she's much younger than Whip, she's a heavy drinker. And it's later revealed during the hearing that she's also received recovery and intervention treatments before, and has struggled on and off with alcoholism over the years. Maybe part of the reason why she and Whip ended up hooking up, because they had that aspect in common. Just a quick side note, it's certainly not uncommon at all for addicts to get involved romantically or socially with other addicts, because much like the way war veterans or people who've been through a natural disaster together will connect, there's an intrinsic level of understanding that you get it. You know what it's like, so clearly you get me too, so let's get close, let's hang out together. And it's helpful too, because for a lot of addicts struggling with that self-loathing, that often goes hand in hand with a feeling of social isolation and depression, feeling alone, that you don't really have anybody you can count on. So all this is to say that we never really learn the full extent of how emotionally connected or close Katrina and Whip are, but it's clear that they had some connection, that it was certainly more than just a professional fling. And now Whip is confronted by a choice that he has to make, as Charlie and Hugh have explained it to him before, and as he's now brought to bear during the hearing. If he wants to get out of this investigation scot-free, he needs to lie and say that he believes it was Katrina who drank the alcohol on the flight, who took the vodka bottles and consumed them on the flight over, not him. Hugh and the union have managed to get him in the clear on all other counts. They killed the toxology report. They managed to get it disqualified for technical incompetence, quote unquote. Unions paid off the people it needs to. Looking at the story when I did for this episode, it really was striking how far the lengths they went to try to really enable him to keep living the same kind of addictive lifestyle that Hugh was living. Although, again, if you're somebody who's dealt with addicts or worked with addicts or struggled it with yourself, that might not be as strange as it sounds, actually. It's easier to enable an addict's behavior than might first seem apparent, even by people who genuinely care about them and just want to help them. But anyway, getting back to the question at hand, what is Whip to do? The only way for him to walk away from this is now to publicly destroy the memory and reputation of Katrina, the one crew member who he was intimate with and who then died on the flight. And to Whip's credit, this is the one lie that he can't bring himself to tell. What does he do? He doesn't lie. He confesses everything. He tells the truth finally about his alcoholism, about how he was the one who drank the vodka on the flight over, about how he's been drunk and using cocaine repeatedly in the days before, and everything else that happens. And so that's it for him. He loses his pilot's license and he's sent to jail for several years. And it seems like, on paper anyway, this is the end of him, of everything for him. But actually, in fact, as he ends up saying to a counseling group that he starts attending in jail, in spite of everything, he feels free now, because for the first time, he's sober and in control of himself. What is the breaking point for him ends up also being his chance to truly change. But it takes a moment of complete and total surrender in order to begin that transformation and healing process. It takes him owning up to everything that he's done, to stop running from himself and stop trying to conceal and control his hatred of himself, to make that change, to set in motion, rather, the events that will allow him to make that change and heal properly. So in light of everything that has now happened, what's his diagnosis and what's the treatment that we end up doing with him? Well, diagnosis-wise, it would be alcohol and cocaine abuse disorder, but it would be in remission, since in jail at this point we can assume that he's safely detoxed and he's obviously in a supervised environment with clear health standards and regulations. So we'd say that it's still there, it's still part of his history, but it's in remission at this point. He's no longer actively consuming the substances. In addition to that, I would also probably give him a diagnosis of depressive disorder, although considering that he made the biggest, the first and hardest step by owning up to his problem, admitting that he was an alcoholic and that he needed help, I think I would actually downgrade from major to moderate in terms of the severity, because he does genuinely seem happier with himself, or at least more at peace with himself, and a little more functional. Again, ironically, as he says, even though now I'm in jail and in prison. But there you go. Sometimes it may not be what is conventional, but sometimes having the space away from the patterns and the negative lifestyle choices that you've been making up till this point is really what it takes for you to start to make that mental shift in terms of how you view yourself emotionally. On top of that, I would also give him probably I might give him an unspecified PTSD or other trauma stressor-related disorder, just to make sure that the events of the flight are accounted for as well. Even though, Whip was really great at suppressing all of his emotions for years, and he was well practiced with giving the illusion that he was functional, even after the traumatic events of that crash, doesn't mean that he wasn't affected by it. All of that is there, and even if it's been muted for the whole aftermath and leading up to his confession at the hearing, he's still going to be feeling that. He's still going to be having probably some PTSD symptoms that will come up now that he finally has the space to feel and process them properly. That's something I've observed with some clients as well, actually, is that when they were in the middle of a traumatic ordeal, or actually, let me rephrase that. If they'd been through a traumatic experience, but then following the traumatic experience, they had to go through a lot of follow-up stressors, which may or may not be related to the trauma itself. Often this acts as creating kind of a delayed response for the PTSD symptoms. The body keeps the score, as Dr. Wessel-Banderkoek says in his book, but it doesn't always bring it up for us right away. But it will come in time, and it can be a little jarring, because as soon as we get to a place that's a little more stable and calm in our lifestyle after the trauma and after the stress, that can sometimes be when the worst of the emotional repercussions finally hit us, and that wave breaks. And that can be surprising and startling if we're not expecting it, or we don't know that this is what happens. And so for Whip, even though he's feeling much better with himself in terms of his addiction, it's not out of the realm of possibility that this is when the trauma symptoms from the flight might actually start to hit him. So I'd want to be prepared for that and make sure that that's on the diagnosis record as well. So treatment, going from there, what are we going to be doing in therapy? What are we going to be talking about? Well, the first thing I would do is probably assess, as I said, for the trauma symptoms, if they are starting to come up, and how severe are they. And a lot of what I would do, I think, would depend on that aspect first. Because if he's starting to go now into PTSD response to the flight, that's what I would want to be our initial focus, is let's talk about the flight. Let's break this down. Let's, see if I can teach you some soothing skills, deep breathing, muscle relaxation, figure out a way to help you make sense of the flight, of the crash. I would say from an emotional standpoint that is separate, or is not overly wrapped up in the narrative of your alcoholism. And that's not to say that the two aren't connected. Of course they are. But I think giving Whip maybe some space to just kind of talk about the crash for the sake of talking about the crash, rather than talking about how his alcoholism was wrapped up in that event as well, might actually be to his benefit, because it could give him the chance to properly grieve the deaths of Katrina and the other crew member, as well as the passengers, as well as perhaps feel for the first time properly some of the gratitude that the surviving passengers expressed for him. And then he actually talks about that at the end of the film. He mentions writing letters to the families, both thanking and apologizing for his responsibilities and his failures during that whole ordeal. So maybe bringing those into the mix too, and seeing how those factor in purely in terms of the life or death scenario that they all face together. Because it can be hard to parse apart trauma narratives. And when Whip was dealing with as much as he was in the immediate aftermath, there was probably a lot that went unfelt, to say nothing of what went unsaid, because of everything with his alcoholism that had to take priority first. And then once we've gotten through that portion of treatment, then it was going to be time, now that he's sober, to dive into the other trauma behind his addiction itself. And here's the thing about trauma and addiction. It's always there. Behind every substance addiction, there is always an underlying emotional burden, often one involving trauma, for the person who is struggling. Many addicts don't want to do this after getting clean, but really getting clean from the substance, becoming sober, whatever that means, whether it's from alcohol or opioids or what have you, is really only half the battle. Because remember what I was talking about earlier with alcohol for Whip being a form of self-medication. The deeper question is, what was he self-medicating for? It wasn't just the emotions that the plane crash was bringing up for him. That was in the moment, and that was his coping response being activated to address a problem of the moment. The real question and the real core issue here is, what had he been using alcohol for years and years to mask? Why did he start having to rely on alcohol in the first place? What was hurting him? What was paining him? And so to answer that, we have to go back into his childhood. We have to go back and explore some things that are in the film, actually. If you look and listen very, very carefully, they're brief, and they're very fleeting, and they're not even on the screen in front of you. They're not in the foreground or in center focus, but they are there. Whip's home that he spends most of the story in is actually not his, it's his grandfather's. It's an old farm where his grandfather, who was a pilot and who his father was also a pilot, used to have their crop dusting business that they operated out of. And we see at one point Whip, during one of his binge drinking sessions, watching old home movies taped by his father on the television there. And we can pick up, even though it's very brief, and even though the focus at this point is actually Nicole when she comes back and sees how severe Whip's drinking is and is trying to help him get out of the chair and get back to bed, we can see in the background some of the dynamic that was present between Whip and himself, Kid Whip, baby Whip, and his father and grandfather. And the sense that I got from it was that his father and grandfather didn't really see eye to eye on a lot of matters, that Whip had a much more positive relationship with his grandfather than his father, and that Whip liked flying, and so did his grandfather. And his father, though he was a pilot too, was a lot more domineering in his dynamic and in his communications that he's conveying to Whip. I'm blanking on the exact wording, but a couple of times we hear him say things from behind the camera to Whip about, watch out for that. Hey, remember your place. Even though it's a home video that's being recorded and supposed to be maybe a happy memory, or there's an undertone, what could have been some very strict disciplining, maybe even physical or verbal abuse going on. In any sense, the impression that I got from listening to the audio in that scene was that Whip's father was not a man who was open with his feelings, and not someone who, if he did love his son, was ever going to be very open about it, very candid. The impression I got was that he had expectations for Whip. He had a box that he wanted Whip to fit into as he got older. And if Whip didn't like that, too bad for him. The other subtle thing we can pick up on from Whip's background and childhood is briefly he mentions when he and Nicole are, for lack of a better word, trauma bonding and sharing about each other's pasts. Whip mentions that his mother died when he was very young. And he doesn't give many details, but we can infer, I think, that because she's not in the video, maybe she was still alive at that point, but maybe not. In any case, it sounds like that was a loss that he never really got a chance to properly process or come to terms with, and that may have also had a negative impact on the dynamic between him and his father as well. So a lot of this is speculation, but without question, there's a lot of repressed emotions that need to be given voice and sat with, and most importantly of all, heard without judgment. So that, I think, would be the second and probably the biggest focus of therapy with Whip. Because even though he's made it to the sober stage, and even though he's now in an environment where he has a lot more support and a lot more people and a lot more insight about his situation, the work's not over yet. And it's going to be tough, I think. It's going to be a lot to ask. And the important thing is not to put any pressure on him, to expect this, but also to be, to some degree, to be honest with support and with empathy, but to be honest with him that if he wants to continue the work that he began when he told the truth at that hearing, he's going to need to take the next step and examine the reasons behind why he became addicted to alcohol in the first place. And this is as good a time as any. Now that he's sober for the first time, he's actually in a place where he may be capable of doing that and taking that next step to that deeper work. If we do make it that far and we do actually go through that process, that deep dive through his past, the next step would be to rebuild his self-esteem. There's a scene in the story where Hugh Lang, the lawyer, says to, when he finally has just kind of had enough of Whip's behavior and drunkenness, he kind of hits Whip with a startling truth. He says to him, after the crash, the airline put together a series of simulations to try to recreate the accident and see at least in a simulated recreation what was going on. They had 10 different pilots test out the simulation under the exact conditions that you did, and all of them crashed the airline. All of them crashed with no survivors on board. None of them did what you managed to do. I'm disbelieving of what an arrogant, drunken bastard you are, but I'm also in awe because of what you pulled off. You did something that saved all these lives that nobody else apparently could have done. And so one thing that I might ask Whip in therapy at this point, when we're talking about creating a healthier self-esteem and a happier perspective, is if 10 simulations failed to do what you did while drunk and high, what does that say about who you could be while sober? And just go from there. Transition from self-esteem into more identity-based work. Look at the strengths that he may have had once, even if he's lost them. Ask him about what are his new strengths or new ideas for passions, for hobbies that maybe he's never considered before. Does he want to look into flying again, if that would be possible? Is there a new path for him now? Either in jail or out of jail, is there something else that can give his life meaning and give himself as a person a sense of positive identity and self-regard? And the great thing is that at the end of the story, we see his family, actually, his son, and perhaps his wife, although they're divorced. At least, her letting his son visit him in jail, I think, shows this, that she approves of this too. His son helps him to ask that question of identity when he brings him an essay that he has to write for school, which is about the most interesting person I've never known. And he asks his father, "So, who are you?" And Whip, to his credit, says, "That's a good question." Well, that's going to do it for this episode. As always, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you all next time on Therapy by the Book.